All right, this is video number 3 in my little mini series here on which Bible version should I use. If you haven't watched the other ones yet, I want to encourage you to go back and watch those other ones. The links will be in the description here under this video, and then come back and watch this one because this one builds on what you have hopefully learned in the other videos. So we're just going to jump right into this today. We have looked in the past here already at two things we need to understand when we look at this whole idea of what Bible version should we use. And the two things are the underlying text and the methods of translation. If you understand those, it will really help you in understanding this rather than just arguing from what you like or what you think or what you've always used or whatever, okay? So in the previous videos, we talked about the biblical text, the underlying text. How did the Bible actually come to us? We discussed the Masoretic text of the Old Testament, which really isn't as you know, people aren't arguing about that so much, but it's the New Testament where you really have the knock down, drag out fights, right? Because you have the discussion about the different text types, the Alexandrian text type, the Western, which really isn't too big of a deal in this context, but then the Byzantine area text type, which basically is where the Textus Receptus come from. And that's usually where all your arguments about this are, whether you should use something like the Alexandrian text or the Textus Receptus, the Byzantine text, things like that. So we talked about that in the previous video, so I would really encourage you to go and watch those. But we have our two things we need to understand when we talk about Bible translations. One is the underlying text, and today we're going to talk about the methods of translation. This is also very important because how you translate something makes a huge difference, obviously, and what the end result is going to look like. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we really get into this, we just need to understand something, that translation of anything is not a straightforward process necessarily. It's in many ways more like an art form, because it's not like there's one word and it gets translated always to another language as an exact same word. You have to look at context, and you have multiple words that can mean the same thing or basically the same thing. So words can be translated differently as you go from one language to another. And the Bible being written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek means that we have to translate it into English, and how the translator actually does this makes a huge difference in what the end result is going to be. So if you know anything about any other language, you know that this is very difficult to do. I have a background in sign language. My wife and I were interpreters for the deaf for many years, and so I understand it. And we don't call it sign language translation. We call it sign language interpretation, because if you know anything about sign language, you know that you have to give ideas more so than specific words. It just doesn't work that way. You know, most words do have a sign, but it's not just I hear a word and I sign it. I have to give a totally different idea. I'm hearing what the speaker is saying, and then I am interpreting it into how the deaf person can understand. So that's interpretation. And there's a lot of interpretation even in translation between any kind of languages, because it's not just straightforward. It's not just one for one. We have things like figures of speech. I mean, figures of speech are torture for sign language interpreters, because many times they mean nothing to the deaf people. And you have to explain them, and then they love them, right? But we learn these things just by hearing them all around us every day. But translating it to another language just doesn't mean anything to them. One example that we have in the Bible is 1 Samuel 24:3, where King Saul went into a cave and covered his feet, as it says in the King James. It covered his feet. Now, what does that mean? He went into a cave so he could just cover his feet? Were they cold or what? No, it was a figure of speech, meaning he was going in there to use the facilities, as we would say, to use the bathroom, to relieve himself, right? And those are all also figures of speech that we use, and someday someone might dig up some of our written things that we have, and they say, what does this mean to use up facilities? I don't understand. Use up what facilities, right? Might not understand these things. So these are the things that interpreters have to deal with and translators have to deal with when they're going from one language to another. We also have synonyms. Words with similar meanings. And this gets to very hard. How do you translate that into another language? One example in the Bible is the word agape. Many people know the word agape. It's a Greek word for love. Greek has many different levels of words for love, and the deepest one is agape. And even in some Bible translations, King James, for example, it'll translate it differently. It'll translate it as love, but we have the famous 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, where in the King James is translated as charity. And it's perfectly fine. You can translate that word of love or charity because it means the same thing. The problem is in English today, if you say charity, you're not always thinking how I love someone. You're thinking of doing something for someone that has less than me, like I'm giving to a charity, to a charitable cause. And it kind of almost has a demeaning aspect to it, but it's exactly the same word in Greek. It's agape. We could say love suffers long. We could say charity suffereth long. It means exactly the same thing, but the connotation might be a little bit different today. So as the translators look at these things, they have to say, okay, how is this going to resonate with the readers and how close we're going to get to the originals? You know, I'm going to try to bring those exact same words in as much as I can, or am I going to try to give the feeling? We're going to talk about how they're going to do that here in just a little bit. Another word that we need to understand is the word transliteration. Maybe you've heard the word transliteration. Some people will say, well, my Bible is a transliteration of the Greek. That is impossible. Any language from one to another, you cannot transliterate it. Transliterate is taking the letters and giving the same sounds into another language. So if I had a Bible that was a transliteration of the Greek, it would be very weird, right? You know, because it would sound like Greek, but it'd be an English letter. So technically that's what transliteration is. But when people say that, usually what they mean is it's word for word. You know, if the Greek had the, then English has the. But you can't do that between languages. It is impossible. There are some examples of transliteration that have come from other languages. For example, even in the Bible, the word deacon. The word deacon, it's actually a transliteration of the word diakonos, which means minister or servant. We just said, hey, that sounds great. Let's take that and let's put it into English. And now everybody knows the word deacon. The word angel. The word angel is a transliteration of the Greek word angelos, which simply means messenger. Now, what does that mean when you translate it over? This is interesting because when we think of an angel, sometimes we think of a cute little cherub with wings or something like that. But the Greek word means messenger, which could mean different things. It could mean a messenger from God, a being that is there in heaven with God and comes and shows up on earth. Or there's question in Revelation where this message is given to the angel of the church in Thyatira, an angel of the church in Smyrna, right? And you have all these angels. Well, does that mean every church has an actual heavenly being? Or is it the pastors? I tend to think it's talking to the pastors, the messenger. Because that's what the word means. It means a messenger, and it can mean different things. So when you translate this, how are you going to translate it? Paul used the term about his thorn in the flesh. He says, I have this thorn in the flesh. He calls it the angel of Satan to buffet me, to beat me up, right? He says, this thing is an angel of Satan. Well, what do you mean by that? It's a messenger. It doesn't mean that some angel with wings, and that's, questionable anyway. But it's a messenger. Something has come from Satan to give me trouble. In Mark chapter 1, verse 2, John the Baptist is referred to as an angelos. No one thinks that he was an actual angel as something came from heaven, but he was God's messenger. So you see, as you're translating, you have to look at these things and say, how am I going to translate this into the new language where it actually means the right thing? Because you can't just take always one word and put it into another language. So sometimes it can be very difficult to get across ideas. And this sort of gives us a little sympathy for the translators as they're trying to figure out, how do I actually put this in the other language? So now this leads us to a question about translation. As we're looking for a translation, whether you are a translator and you're translating to another language, or you're looking for a Bible version, here is a question that we need to ask. And this is important, so I want to show it to you. Here's a question. Are we looking for the version that most accurately represents the wording of the original, or the one that most accurately represents the message of the original? Because sometimes you can't have it both ways. So this is very important. You can see why it can be choppy. Am I looking for one that mostly gives me the wording of the original or the message of the original? All translators have to consider that as they're sitting down to translate anything from one language to another. And of course, the Bible, because the Bible is so important, you have to look at that and say, how am I going to do? I want to do this right. What am I going to do? So to help us understand this, we're going to look at some different methods that people use in translating, which helps us really to understand why some of the Bibles look so different other than the underlying manuscripts. So look at this graphic right here. This is the problem that a translator has. They're going from the original language over to English in this case, and it has to go through the translator. So the translator has to make some decisions, and how he or she decides to do this will crucially impact how the final version turns out. So let's look at some of the different methods that they actually use. The first one we're going to talk about is called formal equivalence. Okay, this is what you might hear often referred to as word for word, which isn't really that way, but that's what they strive for. Literal, you hear about literal interpretation. Even though even the most formally equivalent translation cannot be literal, cannot be word for word, because you cannot do that between two languages. It attempts to retain the original wording, structure, and idioms. Okay, so you can obviously see right off the bat that this might be a little bit confusing in some ways, because it might have some idioms like covering his feet, like the King James. It's a formally translated translation. What does it mean to cover your feet? Well, you have to do some digging, and look at context and maybe some historical things, and you have to figure this out. So it's a little bit harder in that way to understand, but they're just saying, this is what it said, this is how, we're just going to translate what it says, and you do the work of you trying to figure out what it means, okay? And there's positives and negatives, of course, but let me show you this first of all. This is what formal equivalence does. They take the original languages, it goes through the translator, and the burden of interpretation is on the reader. Now, there's a lot of interpretation within the translator. You have to do that when you translate anything, but it comes across and you say, well, what does this mean covering his feet? As the reader, it's my job to figure that out. I don't understand. I got to go and I got to figure it out, find commentaries, find whatever, to find out what this weird statement is all about. Okay, so the burden is on the reader to figure out what is going on. Less burden is on the translator as far as telling you what it means. So there's positives and negatives of this. The positives are obviously it's more faithful to the original. Recognizes verbal inspiration, because I believe in verbal inspiration, which is that every word that was originally written down in the original languages was exactly what God wanted. Now, what did the original one say? That's the question that we talked about in the previous videos. Less dependence on the interpretation of the translator. Okay, so there's less on that middle guy, and it's more of the burden on me to figure out what it's saying. So those are positives. I like that. But the negatives, obviously, that this is more difficult to understand. There's some things that are going to show up in the translation that you're going to be like, what? I don't get this, right? There'll be some idioms, some figures of speech that might not make so much sense. And the interpreter, I mean, the reader has to interpret things more. It's not just so simple to sit down and just read, because you're going to be caught up in some things and say, well, I don't understand. What does that mean? And one negative, of course, is that strict formal equivalence is impossible. Even in the King James, that is probably the most popular, obviously, formal equivalent translation. If you look in your King James Bible, you see some words that are in italics. Well, the translators put that in there because they say this word was not in the original, but I can't make this sentence flow without putting this word in. So they do that. They put in italics to let you know, hey, this wasn't there in the original, but I have to put in to make this make sense. And I think that's cool that they did that, because it just helps you if you're really trying to find out what did the originals say. But they have to do that because you can't just go straight from one language to another. That's an impossibility. So obviously the King James is a formally equivalent translation. The New King James is, we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but that basically is also the New American Standard Bible, English Standard Version, and they're all going to be somewhere within a continuum here, but generally they're known as formal equivalent translations. So now we move to the next method of translation, which is called dynamic equivalence. This is more dynamic, okay? There's a lot more interpretation by the translator in this. Basically, the goal is to produce the same effect. That's important. The same effect on the modern readers that the original readers experience. So when you read a dynamically translated translation, they want you to say, wow, just like the original readers were. Man, that's just going to strike you just like it struck them. With a formal equivalent, you'd be like, I don't get it. And you study it, and then you've kind of lost some of the punch. But this will have more of a punch. It's often said more of a thought for thought. Rather than formal equivalent, they attempt for word. Dynamic equivalence is thought for thought. So here's our little graphic. It attempts to convey the thought. See, what you can see now, what has happened is we've moved the burden of interpretation from the reader to the translator. So the translator is saying, what does it mean when it says Paul covered his feet? Maybe I would use a term like he went in to relieve himself, because English-speaking people would understand this, okay? And so that's what it means to be equivalent. So you read it, you don't have to question it, you don't have to go and look up commentary or whatever. They just try to say, hey, look, this is what it means. And it's completely fine because that's exactly what the original said. But they're just making it so they understand. Now, there's positives to this. Positives is that it's easier to understand. That's why people read dynamic equivalent translations. You just read it, and there you go. You don't have to go and study. Well, obviously, you have to study a lot of the Bible, but some of these idioms and things, you don't have to sit there and say, what in the world is he talking about? It just says it. So there's less interpretation by the reader, which is a positive. But there's negatives that go along with it. And the negatives are that it is less faithful to the original. I didn't say it's wrong. I didn't say it's unfaithful, but it's less because what if the translator got it wrong? What if he misunderstood what it meant when Paul was covering his feet? Maybe he didn't get that. Maybe he misunderstood and he put the wrong thing in there. Now it's wrong. A negative that is less faithful to the original, and obviously that there's more dependence on the interpretation of the guy in the middle. So when I'm reading it, I don't know if he was right or wrong. And so here's some translations that use dynamic equivalence. Obviously, the NIV, probably the most popular one, and people say it's easier to read. It is because it's dynamically equivalent. The New International Version, or the New Living Translation, very easy to read, very easy to read. In fact, it was designed to be read aloud. It wanted to be very easy to understand. So here's an example of one place where you have the difference between a formal equivalence, which is all called functional, and dynamic equivalence. Okay, if you want to look up, and we're not going to look it up right now, but Romans chapter 7, verse 18. Romans 7:18, Paul says, in my flesh, nothing good dwells. What does that mean? Literally, the Greek says, in my flesh. The term flesh is sarx. It would come across in English as S-A-R-X, sarx or sark, right? So that's what he says, in my flesh. Well, a formally translated text would say, in my flesh. And then you have to figure out, what does it mean by flesh? Because physically, flesh is this stuff. It's the body. Okay, that's what Paul says. Some dynamic translations, I believe the NIV does this, it talks about a sinful nature. Paul says, in my sinful nature, nothing good dwells. Well, what does it mean? Is Paul saying because I'm still in my flesh, in my body, that there's nothing good, or because I still have this old sinful nature that I carry around, nothing's good? You see, it's different. And so that is where the interpretation of the translator comes in very crucially. Now, I happen to think in that specific illustration that those dynamic translators get it wrong. I think Paul is saying, because I'm in my flesh. That's exactly what he said. And he says, in my flesh, because I'm still in my body that hasn't been saved. If you're a Christian, your body has not been saved, not yet. And one day after you die, later on, God will give you a new one. But now you're still in the flesh, so you want to sin. I believe that's what the Bible teaches. And I think Paul meant exactly what he said. Now, the translators of, say, the NIV say, well, what he meant is because he's still carrying around this old sinful nature. I don't think that's what he meant. I don't think that's what he meant at all. But so you can see how putting the burden on the translator, you're just trusting him. Okay, I'd rather not trust them myself personally. Okay, and the next video I'm gonna show you when we get there how I think, my advice for how to which Bible version you should choose, but we're not quite there yet. So here's one more graphic I want to show you. So here's kind of a continuum. Way on the left side there, well, actually, doesn't do any good if I don't show it to you. Way on the left side there, we have formal equivalence, and on the right side, we have dynamic equivalence, and your Bible versions are going to fall somewhere in there. The main Bible version, somewhere in there. Your more literal translated ones will be on the left, and then they'll kind of go along, and your more dynamic equivalence will be way over there on the right. But there is a third method of translation. It's more extreme, and that is called free translation, or it's paraphrase. Okay? And here's my advice on paraphrases. Don't treat it like your Bible version. If you use a paraphrase, use it like a commentary. Every once in a while, I'll look at one just because I'm studying something, and I say, I think this is what it means, but I wonder if that's the same thing that this dude came up with, okay? Just like I might look in a commentary. Don't use it as your Bible version. What it does is it takes the ideas from the original text, but it's not bound by specific words and phrases. So it's very, very free, and you're putting a lot of trust in what the translator says, so it's not good to use it as a translation. The positives, it is simple to understand. is very easy to understand. Negatives, does this guy have it right? It's way too free, okay? It's very dependent on the interpretation of the author, which we have to be careful about. Obviously, the Living Bible is an example. The Message by Eugene Peterson, J.B. Phillips translation, the New Testament in modern English. These are free translations, so I would not recommend actually using them as your Bible translation. So there we go. We have formal equivalence, we have dynamic equivalence, and way off the other end, we have free translation or paraphrases. And so what I'm going to do in the next video when I post it is I'm going to try to answer the question, so how do I choose a translation? Okay, we've talked about everything. We talked about the underlying text. We talked about how they translate it, and hope you understand that. And then I'm just going to give you some of my thoughts, maybe the more controversial part of it, right? You're saying, okay, what does this guy believe? I want to tell you in the next video how I came to the conclusion about what I used, and hopefully that will help you out. So watch for that video. If I've already posted it, it will be in the link on this one. All right, God bless, and I'll see you then.